Hi everyone, welcome to week 5. I hope you all are doing okay in your various spaces and that the internet is being kind to you and that you're managing to get some outside weather, breathing, air, all those things that are really important at the moment, that are also really relevant to today's lecture. So what I'm going to do today is to continue our thematic approach to talking and thinking about contemporary art. And the reason we're taking this thematic approach is this is what's going to help you feed into the second assignment that you're doing. The second assignment, which is constructing your own imaginary exhibition, which has now become extremely virtual. So your imaginary virtual exhibition. So in many ways, what you can think about is the way that every lecture I deliver that is based on this thematic approach is in itself an imaginary exhibition. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when I talk about my essay in the second half of the lecture today. But first, I just want to give you a couple of updates. Thank you to everyone and to everything that you're doing. I know it's incredibly difficult and frustrating, but we're starting to get there. Thank you to everyone who went to the tutorials, participated in the tutorials. I know there was a lot of great discussion and that you're managing to generate kind of an energy there. We're sorry that the tutorials might seem incredibly short. But we also know that it's really hard work to work in these online spaces. And for that reason, what we're doing is giving you homework tasks that you need to think of as something that you would have done in the tutorial if we were in the same room together. So last week's homework task was to find a virtual exhibition walkthrough, do it, sort of try and follow it, and then kind of upload your response. Now, one thing I wanted to say is that your response may be quite negative, and that's actually possibly not the result of your own kind of technical abilities or lack of or whatever. It's actually the result of the fact that virtual exhibitions, unless they're done incredibly well, are frustrating and difficult. And you always feel like you're not quite getting the full story, that you're missing out on what we might call the haptic experience or the affective experience. You're missing out on the ear. You're missing out on that thing that you might see out of the corner of your eye that you no longer have control over. So I want you to actually make a record of what feels wrong, like what feels like you're missing out on. What do you want from an exhibition? Because this thing about what you want from an exhibition and what you might not be getting in the virtual or online space is really critical for us as we go forward and think about it. And in particular, as we go forward thinking about contemporary art and what its role is going to be in the future. So remember to do the homework tasks, upload your findings to the Moodle page. Remember to do the readings in the lecture. And my suggestion at the moment is if you want kind of a bit more guidance in terms of what to do when, watch the lecture, do the readings, attend the tutorial, do the homework, and spend some time on your assignments. If you can do that in that order every week, you're going to feel like you're in control of your learning in this subject. If you have any questions at any time, you can email me. I think I'm, 5 or 6 days behind in my email responses at the moment, but I will respond. Or you can email the Moodle forum, and that's a really good place to email because it means that other people who have the same question will have the question answered for them. So I also want you to start thinking about your next assignment, your imaginary exhibition. And I'm going to give a rundown on this next week. But the most important thing to do right now is to start attending these virtual galleries. Look through the virtual walkthroughs. Start making records of artworks that you really respond to, things that are important to you. If you're interested, you can join the Facebook group. Now that's really just because I get like constant material through my feed that I think you might be interested in sharing. It's not compulsory. I know there are issues with Facebook. For those of us who live in places who are spread around the world, Facebook is kind of an essential connection tool. For some of you, it's a very distressing connection tool. So please do not think of Facebook as compulsory. It's my filing system. Anything that is essential, I will feed to Moodle. Okay, so this is our update. This is about where we are right now. And I want to move on to the lecture itself and thinking about our content this week. Oh, sorry, one last thing. Soda Jerk is an Australian collective of artists who made this fantastic film in 2018. I've posted to the Facebook page. It's actually being screened live via a gallery in New York. This weekend, the screening is at about lunchtime, I think, Australia time. Strongly recommend that you watch the screening or else read these articles about it. It's a great critique of Australia, Australian culture, Australian film, but also a really interesting way to start looking at these relationships between humans and nature that we're really interested in thinking about today. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to give you a bit of a background to what nature is. We're going to give you some of the concepts that surround this word, the Anthropocene, and some of the contexts for that. And we're going to think about how we got to this point in the relationship between contemporary art and nature. And then once we've done that, in the second half, I'm going to give you a case study which is based around my own thoughts, thinking this history through and also thinking through its implication in my home in New Zealand. So I'm going to go to that in the second half. So in this first half, what I want to do is to give you a rough and ready sort of survey of the different ways that nature has been thought about and why we might want to do this. Now, the key reason for this is this kind of question about what the role of contemporary art is, and in particular now, under this theme of nature, what the role of contemporary art is in helping us think about and understand climate change. Now, this was a fantastic article that used James Gleason's work to think about how art actually helps us process our feelings and our sensations. So I recommend you have a look at this if you're interested in kind of following through. But really, when we're talking about nature and the Anthropocene, we're thinking about the human impact on the global environment. Now, Will Stephan is an Australian scientist. He's key in the global analysis and discussion, scientific analysis and discussion of the Anthropocene and what it means for the planet at the moment. And this is something he said very early on in the discussion. The human imprint on the global environment has now become so large and active that it rivals some of the great forces of nature in its impact on the functioning of the Earth system. And now what he's saying is that humans are now the equivalent of a geological force. And it's that is our definition of the Anthropocene, the moment when humans are themselves geological. And I'm going to come back to this a number of times and I'll explain it as we go through. But first, let's just look at a few histories of this word. Now, I know you've been doing keywords, so this is like a very brief, slightly inadequate keyword analysis of the word nature. Something that comes to mind when we first think about nature is this word natural. And often people will say, oh, nature, it's just natural, it's normal, it's the way it's always been. Many of us kind of might subscribe to this notion that was, key to Cameron's Avatar film, which is something that is nature, is not contaminated, it's natural, it's separate to and distant from something that's sort of called culture, that It is untouched by humans. It's uncontrolled. It's free. This mythology of nature still permeates a number of our definitions of the world and the way we think that the world operates. Now, hopefully you're identifying a few problems in this definition, but I want to just take it through a little bit before we go to some of the critiques of it. This idea of nature as natural, as untouched, as something that is pure, that it operates in a space separate to and opposite to culture, comes from the history of European thought. This definition is a European definition that is based in this idea that there would be a goddess who reveals nature to us. And as you can see in this frontispiece from Erasmus Darwin's book, Erasmus being Charles's father, the goddess of poetry, so art, pulls aside the veil and shows us the goddess of wild nature. So together art and nature are kind of fused, and art and nature reveal each other to us. Another way that nature has been thought about is in art is via this idea of the thing that is distant to and overwhelming to the human. It is greater than us, it is bigger than us, and it helps us understand our place in the world. Now, a number of you will have heard this discussion and analysis of nature via the concept of the sublime, and usually when the sublime is talked about, what people talk about is this exact picture here, which shows the human with his back to us, which means that we're kind of standing with him, as him, and looking out over the sea of fog, in awe of it, overwhelmed by it perhaps, recognizing our own smallness, our own place outside of the greatness of nature. Now, what I've been describing to you is a way of thinking about and engaging with nature that we can attribute to this person, Immanuel Kant. And what I've been describing is the sense of the sublime that continues to dominate our understandings of nature. And this is something that Eva can talk with you about a lot because she did her PhD on this kind of problem of the sublime and how it influences the way that we understand nature today. So Kant gave us this notion of the sublime, which was aesthetic, which was sensuous, which helped us to understand what it was to be human and separated from this unlimited space, this free space of nature. Now, hopefully you're starting to realize that there are some problems with this definition. If nature is always defined in opposition to the human or in opposition to culture, how do we reach this point where the human is itself part of nature? How do we reach this point of the Anthropocene where the human and nature are entangled together? Now, one of the ways that we do this is by rethinking some of these definitions. Now, I've talked to you a number of times about the concept of ekphrasis. And the concept of ekphrasis comes from this history of the sublime and thinking through the relationship between the human and nature. And we've shown you this image a couple of times and this description by Ruskin about how he reads the poetic space of Turner's slave ship. But there's another way of reading this image that helps us to bring together the human and nature in a way that starts to think about and challenge the opposition. And it's that challenge that Turner's actually doing, because you can see here that this disaster that is in front of us, which is a slave ship that is caught in a storm. You can see bodies floating in the water. It's actually an incredibly traumatic and disturbing image. as the slave ship, the Zong, threw overboard a number of the slaves in order to survive the storm, but also in order to claim insurance. So it's a long and complex actual story that Turner illustrates. And Turner's illustrating it to show us the relationship between the environment and the human, slavery and the movement towards cultivation, towards actually changing the planet, the industrial cultivation, large-scale industrial cultivation of cotton in America, and the trades that were going on. Now, Ruskin misses some of that in his description of sunset on the Atlantic, but in some ways, some of it is present in the language that he uses. And this is what we're interested in when we talk about and think about ekphrasis. Can the language we use to describe the image contain some of the stories inside it? And often, can that language reflect this larger relationship between humans and nature? And it's that bit that I want you to think about as we go forward this week. Can the language we use reflect this relationship, whether we reflect it poetically or whether we reflect it through very close description? Is that reflection that is ekphrasis. So the reflection of the relationship between humans and nature is what we're interested in you kind of grasping at in language. So what I said before was that Turner's image brings together the relationship between humans and nature, the Industrial Revolution, and also slavery, the use of humans to increase production on a massive scale. It's these things that form together this definition of nature in the 19th century, and we're starting to get closer to today. So in the 19th century, we have this movement towards the Industrial Revolution. Let me show you there. So the Industrial Revolution is one moment that the scientists say is possibly a starting point for the Anthropocene. The Industrial Revolution begins in Britain when Bolt manages to harness steam and use that steam to generate a motor that can extract coal. This is then attached to another machine and gives us movement. So we have a large supply of coal and iron. We have movement, the transport of goods and people. We have an increasing population. And we also have a very stable government at this time in Britain, so that there's this sense that industry can generate a brave new world. And artists like Turner are there and ready to document it in Britain. The same events are happening in Australia and the rest of the world, but they look quite different. This is what the Industrial Revolution, as it was called, looks like in Australia. So we have Eugene von Gerard painting a fig tree at American Creek near Wollongong. But what we actually have is an image of deforestation. We have an image of the removal of trees. You can see this bare tree line in the background. You can see the path towards the cutting fields where all of the trees are being removed, where there's this mass industrialization happening through colonization. So from an Australian perspective, we need to think about the Industrial Revolution together with colonization. And we need to think about how the two of them shifted all relationships with land and environment, and in particular imposed this definition of nature that I've been talking about on top of country and on top of a very different way of understanding deep relationships between humans and country. So the Industrial Revolution is the moment at which colonization through increased industry transforms human relationships with land, in the words of the scientists, permanently, that we have this permanent transformation, this permanent shift in terms of how the land is understood and managed and how humans relate to the land. Now, in this narrative of sort of European expansion across the planet through industry, we can leap very quickly from an image like this to an image like this. Now, actually, what we're seeing is the same thing. We're seeing mass deforestation. We're seeing control of the environment by humans, and not a close relationship, but one in which humans transform the environment. This image by Stevenson of the drowned lake is one of his responses to the mining and damming of the lakes in Tasmania, and the kind of the environmental destruction that begins to occur. But what he's seeing is actually no different to what von Gerard saw. Von Gerard is also seeing environmental destruction. He's just not presenting it to us that way yet. He's still presenting us an image of nature supposedly undisturbed, but we can already read the disturbance into it. So let's leap forward again. We go from Stevenson to this moment when we start thinking about how have artists responded to and understood this shifting relationship with nature. And if I come forward again, and this is an example I want you to follow through yourself, we get to a work like Olafur Eliasson's The Weather Project, where the concept of nature is challenged again. Here, Eliasson brings nature into the art gallery in the form of a giant glowing sun, which people, you can see here inside the Tate Turbine Hall, people lay on the floor, they basked in the sunlight in the midst of a rather dreary winter. They treated this artificial sun as if it was a real sun. And this is what Eliasson is really interested in getting us to think about the weather, but also to think about these relationships with nature. And I'll leave these links there so that you can follow through on this work and start thinking about it. Because the other thing for Eliasson is that this relationship that was generated was a relationship of collectivity, a relationship of all humans being together under the sun. It sounds cheesy and tacky, but it was, I think, pushing at things that are a bit more sophisticated than my description is at the moment. So the question that I'm wanting you to start thinking about, if this relationship between nature, the environment, humans, culture, our definitions of these words is shifted and changed as a result of the Industrial Revolution, has it shifted and changed again? Is there another shift and another change occurring in the histories of art that we can kind of point at and say, oh yeah, it also shifted and changed then? One of the key moments in the history of art and nature is in the relationship between art and the land. And in the 1960s, there was a huge movement in America towards land art or earth art. And again, I'm going to leave the slides here and get you to have a look through this history. A key marker of this new relationship was the artist Robert Smithson. who worked in the late 60s and early 70s to think about the idea that art needed to move outside of a museum and into the land. He says art in the gallery has run its course. Instead, we should think about art in a quarry, a mine, a lake, or a canal. Now, many of you will know Smithson's most familiar and famous work, which is, of course, Spiral Jetty, a permanent human intervention into the Great Salt Lake. So this is a permanent intervention. It is a geological intervention. It has shifted the way that the lake operates. It has shifted the microorganisms that operate inside the lake. It has, it in many ways models this definition of the Anthropocene that I'm kind of heading towards. So if you're interested in this work, then sort of follow through Spiral Jetty and start to think about how is this a collaboration between humans and geology? And how does the human geological relationship play out in the works of land art that then helps us to really think through and define this notion of the Anthropocene? Where do my slides go? Okay. So I'm leaving a number of slides in here today that are really things for you to follow through on. They're images for you to think about. And there are also just different approaches to how we might talk about this huge theme of art and nature. So if you're curious about the slides that I'm skipping while I'm talking at the moment, please download the lecture slides themselves and have a look at some of the other things. So just very quickly before we finish this first half, the definition of the Anthropocene was initially coined in the 1980s, made popular in 2000 by Paul Crutzen. And it's a very simple word in terms of our keyword work. It brings together the word anthro from human and scene, which means current or new, but also means epoch, like a period of time. It's now agreed that the Anthropocene is the geological period of time after the Holocene. The Holocene is what we've lived into up to either the Industrial Revolution or the mid-20th century. It's defined as the post-glacial period, so the time when human so-called civilization exploded, where there was this kind of mass expansion of humans across the planet, mass agricultural expansion, and also atmospheric changes, like a very stable kind of atmospheric environment. That was sort of the Holocene. The Anthropocene is this moment that I've been talking about today, when industry, mass consumption, mass movement of people, mass urbanization, but also species loss starts to increase at an exponential rate. And the discussions that are happening are starting to focus on a time period that sits in the mid-20th century that says this is the start of the Anthropocene. So works like Spiral Jetty start to kind of point in a way to art's record of the beginning of the Anthropocene. If some of you want to have this in pictures, this is a useful picture. This is the Anthropocene sitting on the top of all of this history. How do we measure the Anthropocene? It's exponential. Many of us are looking at graphs that look a bit like this at the moment, and we're all starting to understand exponential growth. The measures of the Anthropocene that travel from the 1750 to the 200s look a bit like this. The Industrial Revolution that I was talking about is this first period here, the 1750s to 1850s. Is the Industrial Revolution, when things start to increase, when mass industrialization and the movement of people around the planet starts to kind of shift and change. That was originally proposed as the starting date for the Anthropocene, but now the scientists are looking more closely at this period from 1950, where you can see there is exponential growth in a number of things. What does it look like? It looks a bit like this. And the reason that I'm kind of focusing on this, the scientific definitions of the Anthropocene, is that what I want you to do is to think about, okay, if that's the scientific definition of the Anthropocene, if we really are in this new mode of being, this new way, if the whole world and planet has a new operating system, then how does art reflect that? How does art help us understand it? How do we feel about it? How do we respond to it? What kinds of works actually enable us to understand these impacts, to understand the geological changes that are happening right now, and also the atmospheric changes. So this was kind of a bit fast and a bit rough and ready, but I just wanted to get you thinking about this history of how we've moved from a European definition of nature and culture as two separate things that dominated art history up until very, very recently, to a model where we're thinking about humans and nature and culture as one thing, as two sides of a coin, or actually one integrated thing, where humans are themselves a geological force. Okay, I'm going to stop part one there. I know I've gone over time, but I'll stop there. And then when we come back, what I want to do is to give you a case study of how I started to think through what art can do in these spaces. Okay, thank you.